There's a quiet whisper that travels through the factory floor, hums in the drone of the trucks on the highway, and settles heavy in the worn armchair after a long day. It's the voice that tells a man his lot is cast, that the cards he was dealt are the only ones he'll ever play. It says some folks just got that magic touch, that easy knack, while the rest of us, we just keep turning the crank. We watch them climb, those talented ones, the lucky ones, and we tell ourselves, that ain't me. That ain't my story. The belief takes root, solidifies a kind of unspoken contract with fate. You learn to accept the ceiling above you, the limits you're told are yours. But sometimes, deep in the dust and the din, beneath the roar of ambition and the clatter of what's easy, a different truth starts to surface, slow and stubborn as rust. It ain't about the shine you're born with, not really. It's about the grit you choose to collect, the steps you take when everyone else is turning back, the extra mile you walk when your legs already ache. It's about the work nobody sees, the choices nobody wants to make. Because that, my friends, that's where the real difference gets made. That's where the quiet man can surprise everyone, even himself. Now, if you walked into the old Atlas steel plant on the edge of town, past the constant rumble of the furnaces and the blinding sizzle of molten metal, you'd probably walk right past a man named Hector. He wouldn't catch your eye with a loud laugh, a boastful story, or a flashy uniform. He was just there. A steady, predictable presence, part of the machinery almost. 48 years old, though some days the deep lines etched around his eyes like ancient riverbeds made him look like he'd seen a century of shifts pass through those grimy windows. His shoulders, broad and solid, had been shaped by decades of lifting and pushing, hauling and tightening. They carried a slight slump, not of defeat, mind you, but of constant, patient weight-bearing. The kind of stoop that comes from understanding the world is heavy and it's your job to help hold it up. He moved with a quiet, unassuming dignity, the kind you see in old oak trees standing firm against the wind, gnarled and weathered, but undeniably strong, rooted deep in the industrial earth. His hands now, those were a map of his life. They were factory hands, calloused and thick, ingrained with the dark grease that never quite washed out, no matter how much soap Maria made him use on Sunday nights. Knuckles a bit swollen, permanently enlarged from forgotten impacts, fingers scarred in places where a piece of metal had kicked back or a tool had slipped just so. They weren't graceful hands, but they were precise. They knew the exact weight of a heavy wrench, the perfect rhythm of a grinding wheel, the silent language of steel under pressure, the subtle tremor that meant something was off by a fraction of an inch. These were the hands of a man who worked, who built, who provided. They spoke of responsibility, of a life built on honest, back-breaking labor. His uniform, a faded navy blue, always meticulously clean but never new, hung on him with the familiar comfort of a second skin, each crease and worn patch telling its own quiet story of long days and quiet dedication. When he looked at you, his eyes, a deep, tired brown, the color of rich earth, held a certain reservation, a quiet politeness that didn't invite much chatter but certainly didn't push you away either. You could read the echoes of long hours in them, the early mornings before dawn, the late nights after the kids were asleep, the constant mental calculation of quotas and overtime, making sure there was always enough. But if you looked closer, past the weariness, past the acceptance of his lot, there was something else there too, a flicker almost imperceptible, a deep-seated hope maybe for something just beyond his reach. A quiet ambition he rarely voiced, buried deep beneath the everyday demands, tangled up with a profound sense of responsibility to his family. And a fear, too, of being stuck forever, of the gears of routine grinding on until there was nothing left but dust. A man like Hector didn't complain. He just put his head down, did his job, and went home. That was his rhythm, his quiet, predictable life. Or so he truly believed, until one day the rhythm skipped a beat. The rhythm was a steady, grinding hum. Every morning the unforgiving shriek of his alarm clock cut through the pre-dawn quiet at 5 sharp. Not 5:01, not 5:05. 5. Because 5:01 meant rushing, and rushing meant mistakes, and mistakes cost time, and time cost money. He'd swing his legs out of bed, the familiar ache in his lower back a morning greeting, and pad into the kitchen. The coffee machine gurgled its dark promise while he splashed cold water on his face, the mirror reflecting a man who looked exactly like he felt. Tired but ready. A quick whispered goodbye kiss to Maria, still asleep, her breathing soft and even. Alina and Leo were dreaming their own worlds, far removed from the cold steel and roaring machines that defined their fathers. He drove the same 6 miles to the factory, a landscape of faded brick and chain-link fences, the sky slowly bleeding from indigo to a pale, industrial gray. The air grew thick with the metallic tang of exhaust and the faint, sweet scent of oil. He pulled his beat-up sedan into the familiar lot, already half full, and nodded a silent greeting to a couple of other early birds heading for the time clock. The factory itself was a sprawling beast of corrugated steel and dirty windows, humming with an unseen power even before the shifts officially began. Inside, it was a symphony of cacophony. The incessant hiss of pneumatics, the clang of metal on metal, the rhythmic thud of presses that vibrated through the concrete floor and up into his very bones. Hector worked the number 3 press, a monstrous machine that stamped out car parts with brutal efficiency. His job was simple, repetitive. Load the raw sheet metal, press the dual green buttons, wait for the THW, MPPP, and the hiss, then unload the perfectly formed, still warm component. 8 hours a day. 5 days a week, for 25 years. His hands, gnarled and powerful, moved with an unconscious grace, muscle memory guiding them through the ballet of danger and precision. He could do it blindfolded, probably. His mind, however, was rarely blind. It drifted even as his body worked. It drifted to the stack of bills on the kitchen counter, the one that seemed to grow thicker no matter how many overtime shifts he picked up. The electric bill was higher this month. Maria had mentioned Alina needed new shoes for school, and Leo's old bike was almost certainly beyond repair. He didn't complain. Complaining didn't pay for anything. He just worked. He was good at it, too. Reliable, never late, never sick, the kind of worker a foreman loved to have. But reliability, he often mused, didn't quite translate to opportunity. It just meant you were reliably stuck. Hector had long ago come to terms with his lot, or so he told himself. Success, he believed, was for the talented, for the ones who got picked, who had the smarts or the connections. His life was ordinary, dictated by circumstance. He made his choices, or rather, he'd let life make them for him. The easy choices, the comfortable ones, the ones that kept him safe within the known boundaries of his routine, never pushed beyond the expected. Never took the extra step others avoided. The thought of risk, of stepping out, always brought a cold knot to his stomach. What if he tried and failed? What then? Better to stay in his lane, keep his head down, provide for Maria, for Alina, for Leo. That was his responsibility, his quiet purpose. Any other ambition felt like a betrayal of that purpose, a selfish indulgence he couldn't afford. But sometimes, late at night, when the house was silent save for the soft hum of the refrigerator, a different kind of thought would creep in. A whisper, really, of a younger Hector. The one who'd tinkered with engines in his father's garage, who'd sketched designs for impossible machines on torn scraps of paper. The one who'd dreamed of building something, creating something, more than just stamping out parts for someone else's dream. That Hector, with his bright eyes and untamed ambition, felt like a ghost now, haunting the quiet corners of his mind. He'd push it down, of course. Tell himself it was just a phase, a boy's fantasy. Real men, working men, they didn't chase fantasies. They chased paychecks. And he was a real man. He knew his place. He accepted it. Most of the time. One blustery Tuesday evening, the ghost of that younger Hector didn't just whisper, it hollered. Alina, his eldest, was hunched over the kitchen table, her usually vibrant face pale with frustration. Spread before her were textbooks and diagrams for a science project, a miniature bridge meant to withstand certain stresses. She'd been at it for hours, sketching, cutting, gluing, only for it to repeatedly buckle under the slightest pressure. Hector, home from his shift, had just finished washing the grime of the factory from his hands. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her. He saw his own quiet concentration in her brow, the way she chewed on her lip, a habit she'd inherited from him. He saw the same stubbornness, too, in the way she kept trying, even as her shoulders slumped a little more with each failure. "Need a hand, Mija?" he offered softly, stepping into the warm glow of the kitchen light. Alina didn't look up immediately. Her pen scratched angrily across a piece of paper, then she pushed it away with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the world. "It's no use, Papa," she mumbled, her voice thick with defeat. I'm just not smart enough for this. It's too hard. Sarah and Miguel, they just get it, you know. They're naturally good at this stuff." Her gaze finally met his, brimming with tears of exasperation. "I try, but it just won't work. I'm just not smart enough." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. They weren't just Alina's words. They were his own, plucked from his past, echoing the very doubts that had kept him tethered to his familiar, unremarkable path. "I'm just not smart enough." He told himself that countless times. About the foreman's position he'd never pursued. about the night classes he'd considered for a better trade, about the ideas he'd once harbored for making things, fixing things, improving things. He'd convinced himself he lacked the innate spark, the inherent talent that others possessed. Elena's lament was a mirror, reflecting a truth he'd buried deep within himself. He saw her, on the verge of giving up because she believed, just as he had, that success was a matter of intrinsic ability, not relentless will. A cold knot formed in his stomach, tighter than any fear of risk he'd felt before. This wasn't about him anymore. This was about his daughter standing at the same crossroads of self-doubt. That night Hector didn't sleep. The clock on the bedside table glowed 3:17 a.m. Maria was a warm weight beside him, her breathing soft and even. The children were asleep down the hall. But for Hector, the house was alive with the ghosts of his own excuses, brought roaring back by Elena's innocent, heartbreaking words. He slipped out of bed, careful not to disturb Maria, and padded into the living room. The worn armchair by the window offered no comfort, only a stark view of the dark, sleeping street outside. He sat there, the silence pressing in around him, and for the first time in a long time he was brutally honest with himself. Not the edited version he told himself in the light of day, but the raw, unfiltered truth. I'm just not smart enough. He'd used that as a shield, hadn't he? A convenient excuse to avoid the real battle. The battle against discomfort. The battle against fear of failure. The battle against simply trying when the odds seemed stacked. His life, he saw clearly now, wasn't just ordinary, it was stagnant. A gentle, predictable slide into whatever the world decided to hand him. He'd accepted his lot, yes, but not with quiet dignity, with quiet surrender. He worked hard, yes, but always within the bounds of what was expected, never an inch more. He made the comfortable choices, the easy ones, because the hard choices, the ones that truly mattered, felt too risky, too exhausting. What if he put in the effort, made the sacrifices, and still failed? The shame of it would be unbearable. So he'd never truly tried, never truly pushed. He'd let that quiet ambition of his younger self wither, telling himself it was maturity, responsibility. But sitting there in the cold silence, he knew it was fear. Plain, simple fear. Fear of not being good enough, fear of being laughed at, fear of losing the comfortable, if unfulfilling, security he had. And now that same fear was blossoming in his daughter. He taught her inadvertently through his own choices that it was safer to believe in limits than to test them. He had to be the example he wanted her to see, to be the father who showed her that effort and difficult choices trump perceived talent. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, a punch to the gut. He couldn't let his own ingrained fear dictate his children's futures. He couldn't let Elena believe that she wasn't smart enough, because he, her father, had once believed the same thing about himself and had done nothing to prove otherwise. His life, in this very moment, felt like a testament to accepting limitations. And that, he decided, was something he could no longer bear. That cold 3 a.m. silence, it pressed in on Hector, heavier than any weight he'd ever lifted at the plant. He hadn't just seen Elena's fear, he'd recognized his own reflection in it. The years had stacked up, one monotonous day after another, each one a testament to his own quiet surrender. He told himself he was being practical, responsible. But practicality could become a cage, responsibility, an excuse. He'd been afraid to try, to risk looking foolish, to push beyond the comfortable boundaries he'd drawn for himself. And now that same fear was infecting his daughter. Through him, a quiet rage, unlike any he'd ever felt, began to simmer in his gut. Not a loud, explosive anger, but a deep, resolute heat. It wasn't about the money, not entirely. It wasn't about ambition, not the way the world usually talked about it. It was about dignity, his daughter's dignity and his own. He pictured Elena's face, her brow furrowed, the light fading from her eyes as she contemplated giving up. And in that moment, sitting in the dark kitchen, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound, Hector decided. Enough. He didn't know what enough meant. He had no grand plan, no sudden epiphany of a new career path, no lottery ticket. He just knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he could not continue down the same worn path. He couldn't let his fear, his quiet acceptance of the ordinary, define him, or worse, define his children. He was 48, tired, burdened, but in that quiet, solitary moment, a flicker of something long dormant reignited within him. A stubborn, unyielding spark. He would break the pattern. He would show Elena and himself that you didn't need to be born with a special gift. You just needed to be willing to make choices others found too inconvenient, too difficult, too much. The alarm clock blared at 5 o'clock the next morning, a harsh, familiar summons. For a split second, the old Hector resurfaced. The body ached, the mind craved the extra 60 minutes of warmth under the blankets. The thought of hitting snooze, of letting the routine pull him back into its comforting, predictable current was powerful. He could easily pretend the 3 a.m. revelation had been a dream, a fit of self-pity in the dark. But then he saw it. Not with his eyes, but with the memory that had burned itself into his mind. Elena's defeated expression. He swung his legs out of bed, the cold floor a sharp slap against his bare feet. Maria stirred beside him. "You all right, Hector?" she mumbled, half asleep. "Find me Ammer," he whispered, his voice gruff, heavy with the resolve he was still getting used to, just getting an early start. He moved through the house like a ghost, the usual morning choreography slightly off-kilter. He ate his cold toast, drank his coffee, but there was an unfamiliar tension in his shoulders. Today wasn't just another day. Today was day one. The sky was still a bruised purple when Hector pulled out of his driveway 45 minutes earlier than usual. The roads were eerily empty, the streetlights casting long, lonely shadows. His old sedan, usually just one of a long line of cars inching towards the plant, felt solitary, almost exposed. He parked in the vast, still dark employee lot, the only car in his section. The security guard, a young kid named Manny, looked up from his tablet, startled. "Morning, Mr. Ramirez," Manny said, squinting through the booth window. "Everything all right? You're way early." Hector just nodded, a small, tight smile. Just wanted to get a head start. Walking through the silent, cavernous factory felt different. Usually it was already a hive of activity, the clatter and roar a familiar backdrop. Now the machines stood like sleeping giants, their polished surfaces reflecting the dim emergency lighting. He found his locker, shed his jacket, and stared at his workstation. His usual routine was set. Clock in, grab his tools, start the line. But he had an hour, an extra hour. His gaze drifted to the far end of the floor, to the gleaming new CNC machine. It was a beast, complex and intimidating, brought in a few months ago. Most of the guys, Hector included, steered clear of it. It required new training, a whole different set of skills, and frankly, a willingness to struggle through learning something new when the old ways worked just fine. No one wanted to deal with the headaches of programming and troubleshooting when they could just keep turning the same old cranks. Hector walked towards it slowly, deliberately. The air around it felt colder, the metal somehow more imposing. He ran a calloused hand over its smooth, cold casing. He knew nothing about it beyond what he'd overheard, snippets of complaints and the occasional praise from the young engineer who'd set it up. A voice in his head, an old, familiar friend, whispered, "You're too old for this, Hector. You'll look foolish. Just do your job. No one expects more." He closed his eyes for a moment, picturing Elena again, her struggle. And he pushed the voice down. He wasn't going to just stand there. Not today, not anymore. This was the choice others were unwilling to make. This was where he would start. He didn't know how to operate it, but he could watch. He could learn. He picked up one of the thick, intimidating instruction manuals left on a nearby cart. It was heavy in his hands, full of diagrams and technical jargon that made his head spin just looking at it. This was going to be hard. Harder than he'd imagined. But he opened it anyway. The heavy manual felt like a brick in his hands. He flipped to the first page, then the second. Hydraulic actuator sequence protocol. Integrated servomotor calibration. The words blurred into an impenetrable wall of technical jargon. He didn't just not understand it, he didn't even understand how to start understanding it. His fingers, used to the familiar grit of metal and the smooth glide of an assembly line lever, felt clumsy tracing the complex diagrams. He looked up at the CNC machine, then back at the page. It was like trying to learn to speak French by staring at a blueprint for a nuclear reactor. The first few mornings were brutal. He'd arrive, coffee in hand, an hour before his shift officially began. He'd stand by the CNC manual open, trying to decipher a single sentence, a single diagram. Sometimes, he'd just watch the young engineer Mark, who usually ran it, if Mark happened to be in early. Mark, probably 20-something, would zip around the machine, fingers flying over the control panel, eyes scanning screens with an ease Hector could only dream of. Hector would try to memorize the movements, the button presses, the way the engineer leaned in to check a calibration. But when Mark left, the machine reverted to an alien monolith, and the manual became a taunting riddle. He tried, really tried, to follow a basic setup instruction one morning. He thought he had it. He pressed a button Mark had pressed, then another. A light flashed red. An error code he didn't recognize popped up on the screen. He panicked, fumbling with the off switch, a cold sweat breaking out on his brow. He quickly turned it back on, hoping no one had seen. The error was gone, but his stomach still churned. It felt like trying to defuse a bomb with no training, and he was terrified of breaking something expensive. He folded the manual, shoving it back onto the cart with a frustrated sigh. His usual work suddenly felt like a comforting embrace, simple and predictable. The internal whispers grew louder. "See, Hector. Told you, not for you. You're good at what you do. Stick to it. Don't make a fool of yourself." He felt the pull of the familiar, the warmth of simply punching in and doing what he'd always done. What was the point of all this extra effort, this daily humiliation, just to feel stupid? One evening, after nearly 2 weeks of this silent, early morning battle, he walked into the house, shoulders slumped, more tired than usual. Maria glanced at him from the kitchen, a knowing look in her eyes. "Long day, me ammer?" she asked gently. Just grunted in response, dropping his bag by the door. Later, after dinner, he watched Alina struggle with her math homework at the dining table. She had a textbook open, papers spread out, her brow furrowed in concentration. He saw her lips moving, silently repeating something, then a frustrated huff as she erased a long line of numbers. He excused himself to the bathroom. He stood in front of the mirror, catching his own reflection. His eyes were heavier, more shadowed than before. A faint tremor ran through his hand as he turned on the faucet. He was pushing himself, yes, but was he actually learning? Or was he just beating his head against a wall? The thought of giving up tasted bitter like ash. It would be so easy. Just stop showing up early, go back to the old routine. No one would even notice. He splashed cold water on his face, the chill snapping him back. He saw Alina's face again, her doubt. He remembered the feeling of her small hand in his, the weight of her future, his promise. If he quit now, what would that teach her? That when things get hard, you throw in the towel? That some things are just not for you? No, that wasn't the lesson. That couldn't be the lesson. He dried his face, his gaze hardening in the mirror. He might not be smart enough to understand the whole manual in a week or a month. He might make mistakes, big ones. He might look foolish to every single person in that factory, but he wouldn't quit. He just would. The manual was still on the cart. He knew where it was, and he knew he'd be there an hour early tomorrow, just like always. He might not have made progress up the mountain, but he hadn't left the base camp either. And that, for now, had to be enough. He walked out of the bathroom, a new resolve hardening the set of his jaw. Alina was still at the table, head bowed, wrestling with her equations. He didn't say anything, just went to the kitchen and made himself a cup of lukewarm coffee, then sat back down. He pulled out his worn notebook, the one where he jotted down grocery lists and repair estimates, and flipped to a blank page. He started sketching the rough diagram of the machine's main panel from memory, labeling what he could remember, circling what he didn't. He worked late, long after Alina had finally given up for the night, leaving her project splayed across the table. The next morning, an hour before his shift, Hector was back at the plant. The manual was still there, perched on the cart, mocking him. He pulled it down, his fingers tracing the complex schematics. Today, instead of just reading, he went to the machine itself. He pointed, he traced, he cross-referenced. He made mistakes. He had to stop, reread, retrace. It was slow, painfully slow, but for the first time a small flicker of understanding sparked in his mind. He wasn't just memorizing symbols, he was starting to see connections. He saw how the power flowed where the data was input. It was like seeing a single word in a foreign language and suddenly understanding its meaning. A small victory, but it was his. Days bled into weeks. Hector was a fixture in the factory's pre-dawn quiet, a silhouette hunched over the complex panels, a ghost in the hum of sleeping machinery. Some mornings, the frustration was a physical ache behind his eyes. He'd stand there, hands on his hips, staring at a wire diagram that looked like a plate of tangled spaghetti. There were moments he wanted to just walk away, to go back to punching his time card at the comfortable exactness of 6 a.m., to the familiar, unchallenging rhythm of his old work. He'd picture Alina's face, her own struggle, and the image would anchor him. He was tired, yes, a bone-deep weariness that no amount of sleep seemed to fix. But he was also doing something. He was leaning into the discomfort, choosing the harder path. Then, one Tuesday, about 3 weeks in, something shifted. He was tracing a sequence of relays, a particularly knotty part of the system. He'd read about it a dozen times, but it never clicked. This morning, as he followed the physical wires with his finger, cross-referencing with the diagram, a tiny, almost imperceptible click happened in his brain. He saw the logic. He saw the purpose. He connected a diagnostic tool, pressed a sequence of buttons he'd been practicing, and a small green light on the control panel blinked steadily. Not a major operation, just a self-test, but it was right. He felt a jolt, a surge of adrenaline, like he'd just solved a puzzle he thought was impossible. Old man Ramirez, a supervisor who moved like he'd been carved from the factory floor itself, shuffled past. He stopped, watched Hector for a moment. Ramirez rarely said anything beyond a grunt or a terse instruction. "Morning, Hector," he said, his voice raspy. He looked at the blinking green light, then back at Hector's smudged face. "You're early again." It wasn't a question. Ramirez just nodded, a slow, deliberate movement, then continued on his way. It wasn't praise, not exactly, but Hector felt it anyway. It was acknowledgement. Someone had noticed. That week, Hector signed up for the basic CAD design evening classes at the community college. 3 nights a week from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. He'd come home from work, eat Maria's simple, delicious food, give the kids a quick hug, and then head back out. He was exhausted. His mind, already tired from deciphering machine manuals, now had to grapple with software interfaces and geometric principles. There were nights he fought to keep his eyes open, his pen skidding across the notebook paper, the words blurring. But then he'd remember that green light, Ramirez's nod, and the quiet satisfaction would push him through. He wasn't the smartest in the class, not by a long shot. There were younger kids, fresh out of high school, who picked up the software like it was a game. But Hector was relentless. He stayed late, he asked questions, he practiced every single function until his fingers were sore. Weeks turned into months. Hector still worked the factory floor, but he wasn't just a numbers guy anymore. He was the one they called when a particular section of the new line went down. He could diagnose the issue, sometimes even fix it, faster than the senior technicians who'd been there for years but hadn't bothered to learn the new systems. His confidence grew, not outwardly boisterous, but a quiet strength that settled into his shoulders. His back was straighter, his steps more purposeful. His eyes, though still carrying the lines of a life lived hard, now held a different kind of light, a knowing glint, a spark of ambition ignited. One evening, he was hunched over his CAD homework, sketching out a complex part for a hypothetical machine. Alina sat across from him, her own math textbook open. She looked at his intricate drawing, then at her numbers. "Dad," she said, her voice soft, How do you learn all this new stuff? It just looks impossible." Hector looked up, his calloused fingers still holding his pencil. He saw himself in her eyes, the same doubt he'd wrestled with for decades. Smiled, a genuine, tired smile. "Look, Mija," he began, leaning back in his chair. "It ain't about being the smartest guy in the room, not really. Lord knows I was. It's about showing up when you're tired, when your brain feels like a mashed potato. It's about learning what nobody else wants to learn because it looks too hard or it takes too long. And it's about doing the extra stuff when everyone else goes home, when they think their day is done." He paused, looking directly at her. "That's where the real difference gets made, Alina, not in some grand talent you're born with. It's in the choices you make when you could just as easily quit. It's in the work others are unwilling to put in." He tapped the pencil against his drawing. This ain't genius, Mija. This is just showing up every single day and making the choices that move you forward even when it feels like you're only crawling." Alina looked at her textbook, then back at her dad, a slow understanding dawning in her eyes. She picked up her own pencil, a determined glint in her own gaze. Hector eventually became the lead operator for the new automated line, a position that came with more responsibility, better pay, and a sense of ownership he'd never imagined. He still clocked in early, still stayed late, still kept learning. He bought Maria a new washing machine, something she'd wanted for years, and started putting money aside for Alina's college. His small house still stood in the working-class neighborhood, but now it felt like a foundation, not a cage. There are men who walk among us, their hands rough, their eyes bearing the weight of years. They seem ordinary, unremarkable, bound by the familiar rhythms of their lives. But sometimes, in the quiet corners of their souls, a seed takes root. And it grows not from some miraculous gift, but from the simple, grinding commitment to choices others are unwilling